Hello, Toski. Thank you for inviting me here today. I didn't do what Simon did. Kitos. Oh, no. Kitos, not Toski. Okay, Kitos. So I didn't do what Simon did, which I didn't have a slide to say what I'm going to talk about, but there's two things that I want to talk about today. The first is the scheme in Australia, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. I want to just give you a bit of a kind of flavour of that scheme, and I think it will be helpful kind of showing you a scheme in light of what Simon was saying around how schemes can start with a really good intention, but then as they actually start to be implemented, it's interesting where we end up. So I want to talk to you a bit about the scheme. And then the second part of my talk, I'd like to look at what this has meant for community organisations or support providers, because that's been the world that I've been immersed in for the last few years. And I have been in Australia for the last 6.5 years. And I went there because of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, because at the time it looked to be one of the best schemes in the world. And I can get pretty obsessed with government social welfare schemes and was pretty excited about where this could take us, and worked as an advisor to the agency that administers the scheme for the last 5 years. But alongside that, also worked with a community organisation or a support provider, and was able to work with people and families, with colleagues to see, and I suppose I didn't really anticipate this, but almost understood as the government changed its scheme, saw the impact that had on people and families, both positive and negative. So that's why I want to talk to you from both perspectives. I know that there's been a campaign here in Finland called the Not for Sale campaign. Is that right? Yeah, very successful, I heard Simon saying this morning. And in Australia, in 2011, they had a campaign called Every Australian Counts. And the culture in Australia is, one of the very strong kind of principles of the Australian culture is the idea that everybody is entitled to a fair go. So they talk a lot about a fair go. Would that translate okay? Yeah. So a fair go, like a kind of equal opportunity. That's what they'll talk a lot about. And this campaign, Every Australian Counts, focused on the opportunity for disabled people to have a fair go and have a fair go in our communities. And it was a kind of collaboration of disabled people, family organisations, family members, support providers, who came together and invested in this campaign. And it was pretty phenomenal. Like, if you want to study how people can lead a movement, I think this campaign's really interesting, because it absolutely got hold in the kind of mainstream Australia. And you would be listening to the radio and hearing people ring in to say, this is absolutely right, you know, disabled people should have a fair go. And I arrived in Australia just around this time when this campaign was kind of at its height, really. And everywhere you went, you saw posters. It completely gripped the Australian public and absolutely led to the kind of political decision, albeit rushed. It was Julia Gillard at the time, who was the Prime Minister, who absolutely rushed through the scheme that is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So that is our version of personal budgets. But it was incredibly important because I think it has kind of given a platform for both for the scheme to happen, but also for the Australian public to hold the scheme to account. And that's got its good sides and its not so good sides, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But that was really, really important. That was in 2011, and the scheme started with some pilot phases initially in 2013. So we're kind of 5-6 years down the line now of the scheme rolling out, and it's not fully there yet, but that's where we're at. And the scheme, I'll just call it the scheme for ease in terms of translation. So the scheme is designed for any Australian who is under the age of 65, who has a permanent or significant disability, and who requires support that they deem to be reasonable and necessary, but I'll come to that in a minute, to enjoy an ordinary life. And it's based on people having clear goals for their lives, and the funding is attached to those goals. And it is an insurance scheme, so a very big part of this scheme, there is an insurance actuary that operates inside of the scheme that is at the point where it collects data, so much like your car insurance schemes, it collects data and will be in a position where it can predict costs of particular conditions, for example, costs of particular kinds of support. So the idea is that they can invest early, and they're very focused on early intervention for young children and young people, and they're in a position where they can predict the overall lifetime cost of somebody with a disability. And like I say, that has its pros and its cons, but that kind of gives you a context of where this scheme has been coming from. Probably the only other bit to say is that Simon talked this morning about schemes can start from the basis of citizenship and start from the basis of shopping. So what I'll say to you just from now is brace yourself, because this scheme is very much based from a consumerist perspective. So, and I'll talk you through what that means. I don't think there's... This slide is basically just saying the kind of eligibility requirements or the access requirements. That you need to be an Australian citizen, you need to be under 65 when you enter the scheme, you need to live in Australia and have a permanent disability. This scheme also covers people who experience mental ill health or mental health issues, and that's really new for Australia. That was a different funding stream altogether. And if anybody works in the kind of mental health world, this idea that you have a disability that is permanent and significant has been incredibly challenging in the mental health world, because the notion of recovery is not, we wouldn't talk about somebody having a mental health issue that's permanent and lifelong. You know, we talk about recovery. So there's been a lot of challenges trying to have this scheme support people with a disability as well as people with mental health issues, but it does. That's what it does today. Now, this is my graphic, right? And I just want to walk you through in a really simple way what this scheme looks like. So if you were a participant in Australia, and that's what this scheme calls people. So if you were somebody with a disability or a mental health issue in Australia, in a nutshell, this would be the process that you'd go through. So you start by determining, are you eligible? So if you meet that criteria, you'd be eligible. And you would meet a government planner. So this is an agency planner who would tell you that we're going to develop a plan together. Now, one of the things I've learned from working with Simon for many, many years, working in the UK system for many years, is what they call a plan is two things. One of it is an assessment, and the other part of it is a plan. So you meet the government planner, and it's their job to help you design a plan that basically says, this is what I want to achieve in my life, so that's your goals, and this is the kind of support I need to make that happen. So that's what your plan is supposed to say. But I'm just making a very deliberate point that it is a government planner who helps you do that. And you know, my experience in the UK and in Australia, I don't think that's good enough. I think there needs to be other options for people to be able to plan with people outside of government roles. So that might be family members, peer supporters, independent brokers, you know, whoever that is. But at the moment in the scheme, it is only with a government planner. So you do your plan. One of the things you need to know, though, and you'll see just down at the bottom, there is a little graphic there that says line items equals money, dollars. The way the scheme was developed, to be able to price the scheme, what they did was look at all of the human services that are available today. So that can be everything from 1 hour of community support, 1 hour of employment support, 1 hour of therapy, 1 hour of speech therapy. I mean, the catalogue, when it first came out, it had 700 line items. So it had 700 items of support and the cost associated with it. So if I'm your government planner, I help you develop this plan. What's in the back of my mind is that catalogue. So when you say, for example, I want to be able to make friends, that's my goal. And to do that, I need some community support to be able to go out and connect to things that I'm interested in and connect to people. And that the planner might say, okay, well, will 6 hours support be enough? and we might have some negotiation about that, that in the back of that planner's mind is that catalogue that says, so 6 hours of community support equals this amount of dollars, and largely, roughly, it's about 50 Australian dollars per hour for community support. So that's the kind of mechanism underneath that helps when I'm finished that process. I get my plan, these are my goals, and this is the amount of support that I can get and the cost of it. And then the idea is, and it's been very, very strong in Australia, around the notion of a kind of marketplace. So the idea is I take my plan, I go out to the marketplace with all you beautiful providers, because I believe there's a lot of providers here today. So I go out to the marketplace, and the idea is that I choose the one that's going to work for me. So I choose the one that I think is the best match for me. And in the early days, what we saw was if you were a support provider, so if you sold support, what we saw was a whole kind of rebrand of providers. So they all made themselves look lovely, new and shiny. They even moved their offices to be next to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So you actually took a photo, didn't you, when you were there? So the government office is there, and then you've got all these providers in the streets around it. And I think the marketing industry had a real kind of boom from human services at that time, right? So there was this kind of like, we've got to get ourselves looking great. If people don't choose us, what's going to happen? We're 6 years down the line now, and what I can say to you is that there's been very little movement by people and families from their existing providers. And the theory around that was, well, the market does work, so we've been very much pushed that this will work. That we've got evidence around that. That's a bit sketchy, but what we're seeing is that people and families don't necessarily want to go shopping for the nice new provider. They want a partner that is going to work with them to make life right. Does that make sense? Like the notion of consumerism, when I sit in people and families' living rooms, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense. They're not looking at the next nice brochure and saying, well, that's where I'm going to go. But this whole scheme is kind of predicated on this idea that this marketplace is forcing competition, which therefore will increase quality. And for me, the jury's, well, I don't even know if the jury's out. I think I just don't agree with it. But that's the scheme in a nutshell. That's what it works like. Just a couple of bits to say about reasonable and necessary. So this is a very big word, and unfortunately it's a word that we'll hear a lot now from people and families. So the scheme is based on the idea that you can't just turn up and say, I want, 80 hours of support because I think that's what I need. It's got to be deemed as reasonable and necessary. And some of the rules around that are that there is an expectation that the scheme doesn't interfere with existing informal supports. So if you are usually go out on a Friday with your friend, that the scheme won't say, well, we'll stop doing that because we'll give you a support worker or we'll give you some funding for that. So it can't interrupt informal supports. There is another way of being able to see that, which I'm sure you'll be able to see, but that's one of the criteria. It has to be the most appropriately funded. So if there are other departments, government departments, that would fund something that you're looking for, then they'll apply that criteria to it. It needs to be value for money. It needs to be based around a goal or an aspiration. So all people's plans have goals. It has to be focused on social and economic participation, which is pretty interesting because we don't have people who get a plan and purchase a place in an institution as such, but we definitely have some services that I would argue I'm not sure how well they're encouraging social and economic participation. Does that make sense? So I think that's an interesting question about the current provision and what's for sale, if you like, and what people are choosing to buy. And it needs to be effective and beneficial. So that's the kind of government criteria that sits around the funding and the allocation of funding. And there is, at the minute, we're in a slightly good position because lots of this hasn't gone and being tested at case law yet. So there's many cases due to be tested, but yeah, so we're I'm hopeful that as some of them get challenged, I think we'll be in a stronger position to push much more flexible options. This slide is just kind of backing up that thing about there are other government departments that pay for different forms of support, and that the NDIS cannot be confused with them. And there's a couple there, like education. Health is really interesting. So there is a health scheme. There's been many, I suppose, contested plans around what health should fund and what the scheme should fund, which is it was a common debate for us in the UK, but that's a common debate in Australia. And there's some government funding that's related to employment specifically. So there is a challenge around employment in the NDIS and what the scheme will pay for, as opposed to other government departments. And I'm going to show you this because I think it's helpful. But what my personal view is, the scheme is very over-engineered. It's become very complicated with the best of intentions. It's become very complicated, which in turn has led to it being not that flexible. So the way that the scheme it works is that in your plan, if you say, my goal is to make friends, the way that you are allocated funding is in 3 categories. And you can see there, the first one is called core supports. So that is your kind of daily supports that help you live your life to achieve that goal. And that's the one that probably has the most flexibility in it. So, if I'm doing any work with people and families, I'm actively encouraging them to keep as much in core supports as possible, because that's got the most flexibility. The next is capital support. So that's for kind of one-off purchases, home modifications or vehicle modifications, those kind of things, pieces of technology. So and that's very rigid. So if you are allocated, say you need a particular wheelchair, they'll allocate you the money for that in your capital supports, and it's not up for debate. You can only spend that money on that piece of equipment. So you can't move the money around. And then the last one, which we had probably the highest hopes for, but which has been probably the most disappointing, is something called capacity building supports. So that was, I might need support to be able to go out every day, but actually I need some other kind of supports to learn new things or to develop my capability in technology, for example. That buying a support worker might not be able to help me do that. I might need quite a specific capacity building support. And the scheme sees that very much as short term. So it's kind of you might get it the first year or the second year, but it's not something that they would anticipate you have for life. The idea is that it's there to help you learn something specific, to enable you to live your life, but it's short term. So they're the 3 kinds of supports. I think I've mentioned that it's most flexible, capacity building, yeah. So that's just a bit more information about it. So the other thing the scheme has is 3 different management options. So, and I think there's some similarities with your scheme, your pilots here. So the first one is self-management. So that is exactly what you would expect it to be. The idea is that you take the cash and that you might employ personal assistants, you might engage other service providers, but you've got the cash, you've got access to the cash. You're in control of that. The scheme in total is based on 30% of the total population who use the scheme to self-manage. It currently sits at 7%. So you can see there's a very, very long way to go in terms of encouraging self-management. And what's the scheme here, the personal assistance scheme?
You can choose.
You can purchase... Right, okay. Okay, so that scheme offers the most flexibility. So again, if I'm working with people and families, that would be the option that I would always start with. What would it take for you to self-manage? Because you don't have to buy from registered providers. You can purchase any kind of supports as long as it relates to your goal. And we've certainly got better. So when I was working with the agency, my focus was on self-management. And initially, I think the understanding was that self-management means we give you the cash and you do it all alone. And that's not my understanding of self-management. It's not my family's understanding of self-management either. So my niece, our Jenny, has autism, and we self-manage her budget. But that doesn't mean we do it alone. So I know many, many people and families who need support to self-manage. So in Australia, there's been a lot of work looking at what are those kinds of supports that it takes to help people self-manage. And that includes people with an intellectual disability or people with a learning disability. What does it take for them to self-manage and either engage or employ their own supports? So that's one of your options. The other option is something called plan management, which if you imagine you have a plan and you are going to purchase a number of different supports. So you might get some supports from this organisation. Let's say that's community support. You might purchase some support from an employment provider. Plan management is like a kind of financial intermediary service. So it'll pay your invoices for you. So you don't have to worry about the invoices. You don't have to keep on top of that. You pay a plan manager to do that for you. And that is a really popular option. So it's almost like a bit in the middle of self-management. It's kind of, you're not doing it alone. It's an option that helps manage the money. And then the other option is agency managed, which that means the NDIS agency, so the government agency. So they keep your money in your plan. You tell them who it is that you want to use. And then the provider or the community organisation can draw down the money from your plan through the government portal, but it's managed by the agency, so you don't have to worry about that. That one is probably, that's the most popular, but that is the most limiting, because you can only purchase from registered providers. So if you wanted, let's just say, for example, to purchase the supports of a personal trainer, a fitness personal trainer, you couldn't do that through agency managed unless your local gym was prepared to become a registered support provider through the NDIA, which is not really practical for most local gyms. Whereas if you are self-managed, you can purchase the services of a personal trainer. So that just gives you a sense of how different the flexibility is. Okay. So that's the scheme, right? But as Simon said this morning, I have a slightly different way of talking about it, but the tension that I've found being in Australia, working with this scheme, supporting people and families, is this real notion of, it's like we're being pushed around the consumerist perspective. This is all about shopping. This is all about, 4 hours of this, 3 hours of that. So one of the things I early on kind of discovered for people and families was that they were coming out of this scheme with a plan. So they had clear goals and they had access to funding, but it felt more like a prescription. So it felt like, I want to make some friends. So you've got 3 hours of this, 2 hours of that, 4 hours of this. Does that make sense? It felt very, very rigid. And this whole kind of market competition is certainly the space that we've been kind of pushed into. So we've got that on one hand, and then like I say, that's not my real experience working alongside people and families. They are not saying it's all about consumerism. They're looking for real partners to help them make the plans work, and are less interested in jumping from one provider to the other, which I think there's this kind of notion that if you don't do a good job, they're going somewhere else. And that isn't really what we're seeing at all, really. And I suppose the other bit that is, I'm a social worker by trade, that it kind of bothers me a little bit, is some of the work that I've done over the years with people and families. It hasn't been about buying 2 hours of this or 4 hours of that. It's been much more around what's it going to take for you to live a good life, and therefore what resources are out there in the world that can help us do that, not necessarily what can 4 hours of a support worker do for you. And I think the scheme is really pushing people in that direction. The strengths of the scheme is it's certainly, before this scheme in Australia, there are 6 states and 2 territories that all operated individually. and they all had their own disability system, their own disability rules that was all inequitable, not easy to access. So there's no doubt about it. If you spoke to most disabled people in Australia, they would say it's really clear. We now have a clear idea about what we can access. We do get an individual allocation, so yes, it's based on an individual plan. We're having a lot of difficulties around supported living, and by that, the scheme is based very much on a very strong assumption that disabled people want to live together, and which is incredibly disappointing for a scheme in this day and age. That's, when it comes to thinking about where people live, that's what is a really strong underlying assumption. So there's a lot of work going on around individual allocation for where you live. There is a clear distribution of resources, so you will be very clear about how much funding you have and what that's for. And, there's a level of flexibility. So as long as it relates to your goal, the way that you might get there and the way that you might do that has a level of flexibility, but it's very much determined by those different management options, which can kind of stifle your creativity. You are able to purchase a different range of supports. This is supposed to be the positives, so I'll leave that, yeah. So you are able to purchase different levels of different kinds of supports. And like I've said, there is an insurance actuary that is very much underneath the whole scheme, trying to predict cost. And very interested in, and I'm using this word deliberately, interventions that reduce cost. So there's a lot of work, a lot of observation. They're coming out to the sector and trying to look at what interventions reduce costs long term. So that's kind of that is a good thing, I think. Okay, so now I can just let loose. So there's stuff that I think you could learn from this scheme, particularly in terms of your pilots and the work that you're doing, is there's no doubt about it, and we see it in the UK, you see it in Australia, you see it in the States, that where the rules become too tight and the lack of flexibility leads to really poor outcomes. And I see it all the time. And one of the things that we've done as an organisation, as a community organisation, is we've made a really kind of strong stance around that's their rules, but what you and I choose to do. So if you choose to work with us as a partner, then we have our rules and our agreement. And that's been really challenging. So, and we have the same kind of regulation that you have, but I'll talk to you a bit more about that later on. I mentioned before that assessment and planning are merged together and led by government workers who have that catalogue in the back of their mind. So, certainly I've looked at brokerage and intermediary supports around the world, that I would definitely be saying you need a range of options for people so that people themselves can choose. They might want a government worker, they might want a support provider, they might want a peer supporter, or they might want to do it themselves. But at the minute, this scheme doesn't have that level of flexibility. It definitely is pretty complicated. When I showed you those 3 support categories and then the 3 management categories, that has not been easy for people to navigate and get their heads around. Self-management, in my world, self-management has the potential to benefit everybody. I think if the right supports are in place, everybody can self-manage. We do something called shared management. So people can choose to self-manage, and then we as a community organisation will partner with you to help and assist you to self-manage, which has been incredibly popular. Western Australia has been doing that for many, many years and has spent a long time convincing this scheme that that's something that's really necessary. Otherwise, the benefits of self-management are only for a few, for a very limited group of people. So self-management, I think, has loads of potential. It just has not got there yet. Safeguarding is really unclear. So in Australia, there isn't a kind of infrastructure of social work, which has led to a lot of confusion about responsibility. Who's responsible where when things go wrong? So there is a lot of work and has got the scheme into quite a bit of trouble because it didn't have those kind of frameworks in place around safeguarding and responsibilities, where they start and stop. So that's been very difficult. And in Western Australia anyway, regional and remote areas are nothing like what I understood them to be in the UK. I mean, you're talking about they're in the middle of nowhere. And you said there were some places like that in Finland, didn't you? So in regional and remote parts of Western Australia, there aren't any providers. There isn't lots of providers, there's lots of competition, and they just don't exist. So although that's a downside, the good side of that is it's forcing this scheme to be much more creative. So they are looking at things like, what does it take for community organisations to partner with people and families to help them organise supports? The other thing that it's really pushing is being able to pay family and friends. In the regional and remote areas, it's like highly unlikely you won't do that because of the population. There's a lot of regional and remote Aboriginal communities. So although it's an area that I think is not working so well, I do think it's an area that's got loads of potential. There is a really confused strategy or lack of absence of policy around an overall community infrastructure. So, and I think this is largely driven by this assumption around consumerism, that it's almost like, well, if you've got your individual allocation, you're all right then. But we still need a level of community infrastructure to assist people to be citizens and to live a good life. And there is a stream in the NDIS, a kind of bucket of money called ILC, Individual Linkages and Capacity Building, which its intention was to invest in communities. And that has not worked very well. That has been very underdeveloped whilst they've been trying to develop the other part of the scheme. But it's a very obvious absence in our communities. The pricing, obviously the NDIA set the price. So, you know, with their catalogue, they're very clear, this is the price that they'll pay for different kinds of supports. The pricing has been incredibly challenging. So for the organisation that I'm connected to, when the NDIA started, what they were actually offering for an hour of community support was something like $20 less than what the agency had been paid before that. So that's been incredibly challenging. So some of the smaller providers haven't been able to survive that. There's been a lot of providers merge. We found that to be probably an incredibly positive thing, that it's forced us to relook at our organisation and how we operate, which I'll tell you about. But you know, overall, across Australia, they would say it's been incredibly challenging, the pricing structure. And certainly the agency are predicting that once they're at full capacity in the scheme, they are predicting we need to double the workforce. And it's interesting because this idea about competition, in the early days, it was almost like you're all going to be fighting for people and families. And now certainly the position is, it's not people and families you need to worry about, it's the workforce you need to worry about, trying to actually find the workers. John said this morning, the kind of lack of understanding about the contribution of disabled people and support workers in our communities leads to the scarcity of support workers. And I think that's certainly something that's become a very big issue for community organisations. So I'll move from the NDIS to the agency that I work with and just give you a flavour of how we've tried to respond to this scheme. So the organisation's called Avivo. We support over 3,000 people, and we work with people with a disability, people who experience mental health issues, and older people or people who are frail. We are the largest shared management provider in Western Australia, so that is where we work together with people. Either they employ themselves or we employ for them, but they direct their support. So tomorrow I'll be talking a little bit more about the detail of that. But we're the largest shared management provider, and our motto is what makes sense. So we'll do what makes sense. So you can imagine that when this scheme turned up and said, no, you're not, you'll do what we're telling you to do, that's been pretty challenging, right? Okay, in terms of how we look by numbers, we have around 1,200 colleagues who work at Avivo, the majority of which are out in the community working with people and families. You can see the kind of split in terms of the sector. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else you need to know on that. Okay, so I've already said, so from our perspective as a community organisation, we know that there is this crisis coming in terms of availability and quality in the workforce. At the minute, 40% of the workforce is casualised, and there is a kind of national turnover of 35%. And, you know, I think it's fair to say it's not seen as a really brilliant career. You know, the majority of support workers are paid by the hour, so they don't have good terms and conditions. The majority of office-based workers have salaries, but the majority of support workers, that's how they're employed. There certainly has been a lot of tension around self-management, the people who choose to self-manage and employ their own PAs. What will that mean in terms of provider organisations? You know, if we get to 30% of people who do that, what will that mean? And certainly the support workers, the support worker communities that I'm connected to, have definitely kind of upped the ante around, if I stay with you as an organisation, what benefit is that to me than if I'm employed on my own by somebody with a disability? So that kind of conversation is very big at the moment in Australia. There's a tension for us as organisations to, the NDIA have really pushed us into this place of being suppliers. So that's what we do. If you want to buy 4 hours of, I feel like, you know, those dodgy car salesmen who, or watch salesmen who's like, you want 4 of these? You want 2 of them? You know, that kind of, we're being really pushed in that direction. And there is a movement of organisations who are trying to push against that. So things like, we won't call ourselves support providers anymore. We think about ourselves as community organisations, because we're very intentionally trying to create the debate that we are not simple suppliers. That's not our history, that's not our kind of mission and vision, but this scheme is certainly pushing us in that direction. So there's a big tension around that. Certainly the whole kind of market competition has had a really big impact on collaboration. And in Western Australia particularly, I'd say it was probably one of the most innovative places in terms of disability services before the NDIS, and very, very collaborative. You know, the organisations do a lot of work together, and it was almost like overnight this scheme kind of killed it. And it was like we stopped sharing things because, well, you might get all the people and we don't get any. And it just went crackers, you know, I mean, really, really crackers. So there's this movement of organisations that are saying, we're not support providers, we're not suppliers, we're community organisations, are certainly really intentionally trying to push against that. Yeah, our focus is very much on how do we work with people and attract people who want to be in this industry and want to work alongside people and families in partnership. This shouldn't be any big surprise to you that we're also very, very conscious of the culture of our organisation. So there are 2 pictures here. One of them, this one on the right, on your left, is a big scandal that happened in the UK called Winterbourne View, which we're very aware of in Australia. You know, it was pretty harrowing, the kind of abuse that was going on. And then a couple of years later, the one on the right is quite a large organisation in New South Wales in Australia that had a very similar abuse scandal. And all of these scandals point to culture. You know, what's created in your organisations has an impact on how people behave. So we're very, very focused on the culture. And about 3 years ago, we did a piece of work where any opportunity we had when we were in front of support workers, we asked them this question, which is, what helps you be your best self at work? And we asked that to most of the employees at Avivo, so that's 1,200 staff. And then through our partnerships with other organisations, we asked their staff as well, we asked their colleagues. And these are my words, so, you know, we had many different versions of this, but I want to show you what support workers told us helped them be their best selves at work, right? And you can see in the middle, there is being connected to something with meaning and purpose, you know, more than just me. And then around the outside, you know, again, these shouldn't be any big surprises, but I'm ashamed to say they were to me a few years ago, that people were saying the relationship with our customers and our colleagues is what keeps me here. And they were pretty brutal about it, to be honest. So they were saying, the organisation is the organisation. You do what you like. But actually, me supporting Bob is what keeps me in this work. And I was a support worker from being 16 years old, and I really get that. It wasn't about the organisation necessarily, it was about the relationships I had. But they did talk about support work. If you're, in our context, out in the community, we're not in a residential home or in institutions. I can be supporting 4 people over the course of a week. I might not see any colleagues. So they talked a lot about being connected to colleagues and being able to talk to colleagues about the work that they were doing, getting advice and what have you. And they said it was a very lonely job. And certainly that's the case for us in Avivo. They talked about having very little freedom to make decisions, and that decisions were made by managers and then imposed on them. Decisions were made by people like the scheme, the NDIS, and then imposed on them. And they felt where they were doing some of their best work, it was hidden. So they would keep that away from the organisation. They would be doing interesting things, but wouldn't necessarily tell the organisation about it. So they wanted freedom to make decisions. Security and resources was enormous. So they talked to me about things like the way that you employ me means that you limit my ability to contribute as a citizen. So they would talk about being employed on an hourly basis. If people decided if I was a support worker and I was supporting Tim and he decided he didn't like me anymore, tough. I just lose that income. And there's a big debate about, well, Tim has the right to say whether he wants me or not. But when you see it from their perspective, it's, this is such an insecure job that I can't get a bank loan, I can't get a mortgage. Those kind of conditions that help me have a good life, this job doesn't help me do that. They talked about feeling safe and working in a place where they did feel safe and supported and they could make mistakes. There was the opportunity to grow and develop, and this is the kind of big but, which we've tried to respond to, but not necessarily in the way that the organisation thinks they should. So they gave me, honestly, example after example after example of doing training that bared absolutely no relevance to the person that they were working with. And they wanted training on kind of ordinary community things, not necessarily specialist disability things, but what they felt was that was what was always on offer. And that it was a role that actually had some connection to their local community. And the way that we employ people at the time, we could send them all over the place. So there was no kind of sense of, I work in my hometown, I'm invested in my hometown. They were all over the shop, or all over the place. So it won't come as any big surprise to you that we now call these the colleague keys. So they are different words because they have a slightly different context, but I was pretty shocked. I remember sitting on an aeroplane and messing about with this and being like, oh, well, would you know it? What's important to people is important to everybody. And so we call these our colleague keys. And as an organisation, we have tried to respond to these things. And we actively now talk about what will it take to support our colleagues' citizenship, as well as our customer and family citizenship. And that's a real change for this organisation. And I'd say it's a good one, right? So I know most people stand up and say their organisations are good, but I would say it's a good organisation. It's been very focused on people and families. This is a very big change to put the focus and emphasis on our colleagues. So that's just saying the same thing really in text. So we've done a number of things, right? I'm just going to talk, so none of these are earth-shattering, but they have definitely been pretty tricky to try to implement. And sometimes I think we felt like we're on a different planet, certainly when we've talked to the regulators. So this thing about being connected to colleagues, we've organised ourselves into neighbourhood teams. So it's self-selection, so support workers themselves choose the neighbourhood they want to work in. And that's been pretty split. So I'd say half of our colleagues have chosen their own local neighbourhoods that they live in, and half have intentionally chosen a neighbourhood that they don't live in. But they've chosen their neighbourhood team. The teams themselves, this is across Western Australia. The teams are based in neighbourhoods, and I'm going to call them, we've got up there self-managing. We've got probably we're at about 70% of our organisation, everybody's in a team. We don't have any managers anymore, so that's a direct response to support workers' terms and conditions. So if we've only got a certain amount of resources, we've been very transparent about what we should do with those resources. And one of the first things that we did was say, do we really need these layers of management? So in our organisation, we had support workers, we had team facilitators, then we had managers, then we had area managers, and then you have an executive team. So you can see there's a lot of management. So we've taken that away. And what people have got is access to coaches and mentors. And there's a very heavy team development program that goes in place. We've definitely spent a lot of time focused on citizenship, and the thing that's been astonishing, that I'm embarrassed to say it, but we've had such little investment in helping people think about their own citizenship that it kind of beggars belief, really, that we've thought they've been helping other people think about their citizenship. So we've done a lot of work around what does it mean for my citizenship and my development. And that's been a real shock. You know, we've discovered support workers who live in domestic violence relationships, support workers who are living in poverty, who, you know, are regularly accessing food banks, you know, that kind of stuff, that we didn't know that because we were never asking those questions. We developed a scheme called Small Spark. So that was based on a colleague of ours who's since passed away, Carl Poll, who was based in the UK. Our version is slightly different, but basically any colleague or customer can apply to Small Sparks for a grant of up to $600 for anything that they think will enhance their own citizenship. And that's been an incredible scheme, actually. So we've had colleagues who've applied for, say, a busker's license to be able to busk in their local town. And 2 weeks later, somebody that they work with has then applied for their busker's license, and now they're a duo working in their local community. You know, there's been all kinds of stuff. Customers wanting to run art classes, all kinds of stuff that they wouldn't have had access to the resources to do so. So we've been doing that now for a long time, and we measure that in terms of which key is this impacting on and how is it affecting our communities. We definitely are a big fan of working together. So we have lots and lots of advisors of EVO that, you know, they're going through the scheme, they're working with the scheme, and are telling us this is what we think would help. And a lot of what they're saying would help is things like support and advice to employ my own staff, support and advice to engage services. So this notion of being a partner in support and less of a deliverer is definitely becoming more real for us. And we are, you know, as a board, we're certainly looking at where's that going to take us. Will we continue to deliver, or will we be more of an intermediary partner? We are really big fans of peer support. So we know through, you know, I know through my own experiences, we know through the advice that we get from people and families, the option to be able to talk to somebody who's been in a similar situation to you is really important. And we've done a couple of things. One is we have a number of different peer networks that people can access. But the other thing that we do is we routinely ask people and families who we work in partnership with, would they be willing to share their experience with another family if we thought that would be helpful? And we've done a similar kind of thing in the UK years ago. And every time we do it, the majority of people say yes. They don't necessarily want to be inundated with people, but they certainly are willing to share their experience with one other family. So we do that routinely. I think this idea about, and I'd said before that we've made a very strong position with the board support, that actually the agreement that we make with people and families is our agreement, that we are not a government provider anymore, that actually the money comes to the person, therefore the agreement needs to be with us. And that has absolutely given us a level of freedom that I think we've been frightened of in the past. So if you ask for us to do something that we know the government wouldn't be that keen on, in the past we will have said no. Now we're pretty clear on, so the government's got these rules, so what is it you want us to do? Okay, let's us make the agreement, we'll support that. And that has kind of, I don't know, just taken us in a very different direction than the one we used to be in. And I think that's it. the thing about, we have lots of advisors across Avivo who kind of keep us right and tell us what we should and shouldn't be doing, I think has been incredibly helpful to us as an organisation. But it also means we are able to talk to government about the things that are working about the scheme and the things that aren't working with a level of credibility, I think, that has definitely shifted some areas. Certainly shared management, it's shifted a lot in terms of convincing them that self-management doesn't mean doing it alone, that you can do it with a partner. So I think that's it. Is that okay?